World War II from 1939 to 1945. First off, who was fighting in World War II? On one side, you have the Axis powers. That's Germany, Japan, and Italy. The Nazis are in control of Germany at this time. Militarists in control of the Empire of Japan, and the fascists and Benito Mussolini are in charge of Italy at this time. Who were they fighting against? They were fighting against the Allied powers. And the Allied powers are the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, the Free French, the French that are able to escape France when France surrenders, as well as China. China pauses their civil war to fight against Japan, to fight against the Axis powers, to help the Allied powers fight in World War II. What caused World War II? Well, it was in part the expansionist goals of Germany and Japan. Germany, that dark brown shaded region there in the middle, expanded in the late 1930s. They moved troops into that green area. They annexed Austria. They took the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and nobody was willing to do anything about it. Nobody was willing to go to war about it. Nobody was willing to stand up and use force to stop them. Japan did the same thing. Japan started out as the Japanese islands, Korea, and Taiwan in the early 1930s, but in 1938 invaded northern China, and by 1942 had taken over a lot of Southeast Asia, many of which were British or French colonies, and the US-controlled Philippines. Adding to the problem of expansion was the reluctance to use force. Both Britain and France were reluctant to use force. They didn't want to start anything that could end up like World War I ended up. So instead, they tried appeasement. They gave in to the aggression of Germany. They said, okay, if we give you Czechoslovakia, will you promise not to take anything else? And Hitler, the leader of Germany, said, sure. But really what he was thinking was, these guys are not willing to do what they have to do to stop me. I can take whatever I want. Now, when he invaded Poland in 1939, they finally said, enough is enough, and that's what started World War II. You'll notice we haven't mentioned the United States. That's because the United States did not join World War II in 1939 or in 1940. It wasn't until the end of 1941 when Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, a U.S. territory at the time. It's not until that happens that the United States joins World War II. The next day after Pearl Harbor was attacked, on December 8th, 1941, the United States enters World War II. So by 1942, all five Allied powers are in the war and fighting against the Axis powers. The next thing we should remember is that those Allied powers, they won World War II. How? Well, there's three big reasons why. One is cooperation among the Allied powers. Now, they didn't always cooperate. In fact, sometimes they strongly disagreed about how to attack Europe when it was controlled by the Nazis. But for the most part, the Allies worked together. In fact, the United States was helping out before Pearl Harbor. Even before the United States was in the war, they signed the Lend-Lease Act, which authorized the president to give weapons and materials to Great Britain and to the Soviet Union and to China to fight against the Axis. So even before the United States was in the war, they were helping out, they were cooperating. And then on the battlefield in North Africa, the Americans and the British pushed the Nazis out of North Africa. And the biggest example of cooperation on the battlefield was D-Day, the invasion of Nazi-controlled France by the United States and Great Britain and Canada and New Zealand and Australia. They worked together and defeated the Germans on D-Day. They grabbed control of part of France and they started pushing the Germans back and pushing them out of France. And that was the beginning of the end for the Germans. The other way the Allies won was through production. World War II was a war of production. The side that was able to make the most war stuff was going to win World War II. And the Allies vastly outproduced the Axis powers. In fact, the United States alone produced twice as much as Germany and Japan combined. By making more guns and more bullets and more airplanes and more tanks and more battleships and more aircraft carriers, the Allies were able to defeat the Axis powers. And the last reason why the Allies were successful were the atomic bombs used against Japan to end the war. By 1945, by August of 1945, Germany had already surrendered. Japan, however, was preparing for a major invasion by the Allied forces. They were preparing for another D-Day, and Japan's goal was to make that final battle as bloody and drawn out and as expensive as possible for the Allies, to try to get the Allies to agree to surrender terms that would be better for Japan, like maybe letting Japan keep control of Korea or something like that. But instead of invading, the United States used the new weapon that they had developed in cooperation with the British. They dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. And then 2 days later, they dropped another atomic bomb, the only other one we had, on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. The widespread, overwhelming, nearly unbelievable level of death and destruction caused by just those two bombs was enough to shock the Japanese leadership into accepting immediate and unconditional surrender, and the war ended soon after the bombing of Nagasaki. Finally, let's finish by talking about how World War II changed the United States and the world. The first way the World War affected the United States was it ended the Great Depression. World War II brought about economic prosperity for the United States. Now, it's true, millions of Americans served in the military, in the Army, or the Navy, or the Marines. But 4 times as many Americans worked in the factories or on the farms producing food and materials for the war. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, as many as 25% of Americans were unemployed. During World War II, those people are going to be able to find jobs because factories need workers. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, many Americans who were able to hold on to a job saw their hours or their wages get reduced. During the 1940s and World War II, those people are going to be getting 40, 50, even 60 hours a week with overtime pay. Farmers even see their income rise to 4 times what it was during the Great Depression. So even farmers are successful economically. World War II was so good for the American economy that for the first time in the 1900s, the gap between the rich and the poor shrunk. The difference between the bottom 20% of the U.S. economy and the top 20% of the U.S. economy in terms of top 20% of wage earners versus bottom 20% of wage earners, the gap between those two groups actually got smaller. Americans were doing so well that they were even able to save and invest for the future. And many of them did so by purchasing war bonds, meaning they gave a loan to the government to fight the war, and then the government's going to pay them back in the future with interest. Another big change was internal migration. Americans began moving around within our country, and it wasn't always distributed equally. For the most part, Americans are moving away from rural areas and moving to urban areas. So we see cities growing in population. Americans are moving to the coastlines. So we see an increase in the number of people living on the east and west coast. And for the most part, we see the population of the north. So that includes the Midwest and the New England down into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. Population there decreasing in terms of the percent of the American population. We see population in the South and out West increasing. People are moving to what we will start to call the Sun Belt. That's for a variety of reasons. One, that's where most of the military bases are. So if you're serving in the Army, you got to move there eventually. Two, that's where most of the shipyards are. So if you're working on building ships or you're serving in the Navy, you got to move to one of those places because that's where the naval bases and the shipyards are. 3, the South and the West did not really industrialize in the late 1800s. But by World War II, they've started to industrialize. They're starting to build factories in those areas. And people are moving there because that's where the jobs are. California sees the biggest increase. By the end of World War II, there are 2 million more people living in the state of California than when it began. Another change was some economic progress for women. Women don't gain economic equality. Women don't, this is not the start of the women's rights movement, but women do have some economic progress. in part because women found themselves able to work jobs that had been closed to them before. For example, steel worker. All right, women were not allowed to work in steel mills around the country. But during World War II, so many workers are needed, including in the steel industry, that those jobs are open to women. And working in shipyards, building ships. That wasn't a job that women could work before the war, but now so many ships are needed because of the war, women are able to work those jobs as well. As a result, women see an increase in pay by 50% during World War II. Now, a lot of these benefits are going to go away after World War II. Some of those jobs go back to being closed off to women. Pay goes back down for women after the war, but some of the benefits remain as we move into the 1950s. Not all, but some. Another group affected by World War II were African Americans. African Americans served in large numbers in the military. Millions have served in the Army and Navy, but they did not serve on an equal footing as for white Americans. African Americans were denied the opportunity to serve in leadership positions, so they couldn't be officers. They were never promoted to the level of officer in either the Army or the Navy. African Americans were often banned from combat units. And remember, this is a war many people volunteered for. They wanted to serve their country. They wanted to help. They were willing to do the riskiest job, but African Americans were forced to work in construction if they were in the Army, or work in the kitchen of a Navy ship and serve as a cook. And they also served in segregated units. On the home front, African Americans saw more job opportunities during World War II, but not nearly on the same level as for white Americans. If anything, the experience in World War II draws attention to the inequality that African Americans live with. And when African Americans start moving out of the South, they're the one group that's leaving the South, moving to cities up north or moving to cities out west, getting away from those Jim Crow laws and those black codes which took away their rights. When African Americans leave the South, now the issue of race in America is a national issue. It's not just a Southern issue anymore, which is why some historians point to World War II as one of the causes of the civil rights movement. For other minorities, they saw some opportunities, but some saw some restrictions. Over 300,000 Mexican Americans served. Many Native Americans also served or worked in industries to help the war effort. But for Japanese Americans, they had their rights taken away. Japanese Americans were forced to live in internment camps during the war. Americans suspected them of being spies or conspirators with the Japanese, and they were not trusted, and they were forced to sell their homes and businesses and move away from the West Coast and live in basically prison camps for the duration of the war. The last big effect of World War II that we'll discuss was that it left the winners of World War II in charge of the world. Those 5 allied powers, China, France, Britain, Russia, which at the time was the Soviet Union, and the United States, are left in charge of the world. And the way they do that is the United Nations is created after World War II. And the United Nations has many different parts, but the most important part of the United Nations is what's called the UN Security Council. The most important decisions made by the United Nations come from the Security Council. If the UN is going to send soldiers or send aid or put an embargo on a country, that's the kind of thing that needs to come from the Security Council. The other parts of the UN can make suggestions or requests, but the only part of the UN that other countries are required to listen to and required to follow, that's the Security Council. 10 of those seats on the Security Council rotate every 2 years, but 5 of those seats are permanent. Those 5 permanent seats belong to the Allied powers from World War II. They won the war. They got to make the rules. They put themselves in the best position. Not only do they have permanent seats on all those important decisions, they also have veto power. So one of those 5 nations, Great Britain, for example, could veto sending troops into Syria if they disagreed with it. Even if all 14 other members of the Security Council, even if every nation in the world thinks it's a good idea for the United Nations to do, Great Britain alone, or any of those 5, can use their veto power to block action by the United Nations. They are clearly the most powerful countries in the world, and the 2 most powerful among them are the Soviet Union and the United States.